Chapter 6, The Posers. Quote by Shams Tabrizi. There are more fake gurus and false teachers in this world than the number of stars in the visible universe. A genuine spiritual master will not direct your attention to himself or herself and will not expect absolute obedience or utter admiration from you, but instead will help you to appreciate and admire your inner self. True mentors are as transparent as glass. They let the light of God pass through them. I love yoga. I've committed my life to teaching it, practicing it, and understanding the origins of it. However, after owning and running a yoga studio in Los Angeles for 8 years, I can honestly say I hate yogis. All right, maybe that's a lighthearted understatement because it barely scratches the surface of how much I deplore the spiritual bypassing conspiracy theorists with insecurity-driven god complexes worshiping the goddess of spandex in a performative spirituality that plagues our modern-day communities. The yoga world, too, has become a playground for people who are more interested in looking the part than actually doing the inner work. In my opinion, we can thank spandex activewear and social media for that. The birth of compression fabrics, sleek designs, and perfectly coordinated yoga outfits ousted the frumpy, sustainable cottons and flowing linens of the hippie yogis of old. Suddenly, yoga wasn't just a practice, it became a performance, a lifestyle requirement for a well-balanced social media feed. I mean, do millennials even know that, well, Koreans have been cold plunging since before Wim Hof took his first breath. But I digress. Now, at first I was all in, +1 for these spandex parties, but I didn't realize we'd be watching authentic yoga slip away as corporations capitalized on the activewear boom, masking themselves as champions of the yoga lifestyle while peddling cheap, toxic nylon fabrics and mindless yoga practices. What began as a spiritual practice was now commercialized into a brand, a more marketable version of yoga that prioritized fashion and marketability over authenticity. What followed? Well, women felt hot. Who wouldn't? With compression fabrics sculpting every inch of you into a sexy hourglass shape. It was like wearing confidence on the outside. But the problem came when those leggings came off, and suddenly, without that snug fit, holding everything in, the sense of empowerment deflated. It didn't take long for the next wave to hit. Plastic surgery obsessions swept in as the solution to staying hot in those ever-so-revealing leggings. I wasn't, nor am I, against feeling hot or flaunting my shapely physique, or even artistically natural plastic surgery. I'd be the first to admit that feeling good in your body is empowering, as well as a huge aspect of what yoga is about. But I got into yoga for spiritual reasons, not for a delusional vanity contest. As time went on, I started to feel increasingly disconnected from where the practice was heading. What began as a sacred journey inward was now being swallowed by consumerism, competition, and body image obsession. I had stayed strong on my feet, persevering after many instances of abuse and manipulation, but this was about to be my takedown. I couldn't escape. What I didn't realize until later was that before becoming a yoga studio owner, throughout my entire career as an instructor, I had always been able to self-regulate my environment. I crafted my own schedule, handpicked my clients, came and went to my public classes as I pleased, and in the days before social media took over, I had the luxury of quality quiet time for meditation and working on contemplative writing projects. Now, running a studio, however, was a completely different beast. And it not only opened my eyes to a whole new side of the gossip-ridden, ego-driven, addict-like yoga community, but now other people's behaviors and performance would affect my business and my brand. So looking back, it's clear that by maintaining strict control over who I allowed in my space, for how long, and on what terms, I was unconsciously keeping my triggers at bay. I never really clicked with the broader yoga community. But that didn't bother me. I was different. My approach was more grounded in reality and science and psychological alignment. I stayed away from the typical yoga cliques and fellow teachers. I built my business, organized my retreats, and produced my own events. I wasn't part of the scene, and I preferred it that way. I remember one of my managers at Equinox once calling me her stealth bomber. And at the time, I figured she was just blowing smoke at me, probably saying the same thing to everyone. But years later, after managing flaky LA yoga teachers myself, I finally understood what she meant. I saw firsthand just how difficult it was to, 1, get teachers to show up on time, 2, ensure that they ended classes on schedule, 3, maintain consistency, 4, respect the studio space, and 5, avoid inappropriate behavior with students. And there's more on that later. She called me a stealth bomber because I showed up on time. I delivered a great class with precision, and I left without causing any drama or issues. At the time, I hadn't realized how rare or valuable these qualities were. Since I dive into the details of how I fell into yoga in my book, As I Am, I'll take this opportunity to share the slightly woo-woo backstory about how I accidentally became a studio owner here in this book. Yes, I am fascinated by spiritual and mystical concepts, but only when they align with reality and science. Even if modern teachings on frequency, numerology, and synchronicity aren't exactly mainstream. So if you're gearing up to judge this next story, I'm not concerned, but try to have an open mind. Owning a studio wasn't part of some grand plan or hidden desire. It all started with a series of synchronistic events involving the one and only Prince, which led me to lean into my first studio. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the LA, quote, conscious, unquote, communities and the camera-ready yoga posers. Purple Rain. In 2015, I decided it was time to reclaim control of my life and my living situation by moving back to San Diego. I'd only returned to Los Angeles because of Jack's manipulative ultimatum, but the pull toward the tranquil, authentic lifestyle of North County never left me. Encinitas was calling me back, along with its sense of community, spirituality, authentic yoga, and surf culture. I found what felt like the perfect sanctuary, a stunning gem of a house on Neptune Avenue in Leucadia, overlooking the ocean. Situated right across from Beacons Beach, it was everything I'd been searching for, a peaceful beachside dream, far removed from the chaos of LA, although I planned to commute to Los Angeles for work half of the week, just as I had done before. The contrast between the serenity of my Leucadia sanctuary and the hustle of LA felt like the perfect balance. I could immerse myself in the calm, authentic vibe of Encinitas, take my dog for long beach walks, and then shift gears when needed, returning to the city's grind for business. I poured my heart into that home, carefully furnishing each room, even custom building several pieces of furniture to create the ultimate beach retreat. The house had a large garage, which I converted into my warehouse and workspace. It was the perfect setup, as I was deep in manufacturing large quantities of clothing, toys, dolls, and books for my growing brands. And then Prince died. Now, let me be clear, I wasn't a die-hard Prince fan. I loved his music, sure, and I had a few of his songs on my iPod, but I wasn't one to follow his every move or know every detail of his life. Yet strangely, on the day he passed, something shifted in my life. I had plans to teach a yoga class to a group of women in my backyard that night, which we followed with wine and cheese on the patio, enjoying the breeze and ocean view. Inspired by Prince's passing, I threw together a Prince playlist for the class that day, dancing around in my living room to Erotic City in preparation. That evening, the women arrived for class as usual. The sky was calm, clear, and starry. A perfect Southern California night. We finished the wonderful yoga session with Purple Rain playing during Shavasana. It felt like the perfect tribute to honor such a remarkable musician and a deeply spiritual man on the day he passed. Afterwards, in the exact moment when the last woman had rolled up her yoga mat and stepped underneath my patio awning, out of nowhere, the sky unleashed a torrential downpour. Not a light sprinkle, but a full-on tropical storm kind of rain. It was so sudden and so intense that we all stood there laughing at the coincidence. It lasted no more than a few minutes, but just long enough for us to joke that Prince had sent us the rain from beyond, before stopping just as abruptly as it had started. We shrugged it off as an amusing, quirky, coincidental moment. But the next day, everything started to change. Suddenly, my life and flow in San Diego just felt off kilter, like I was completely misaligned with the world around me. Doors that were opening now were suddenly closing. It was a noticeable energy shift, as if I no longer fit in this life that I had so carefully crafted for myself. Oh, what's that saying? Man plans and God laughs. That's what it felt like. Around the same time, a massive opportunity appeared on the horizon. Things had really taken off for my children's brand, and I recently secured an in-person meeting with the doll buyers at Target, a huge, beyond epic milestone for my business. Target's headquarters was located in Minneapolis, and the meeting was scheduled for October 14th. And what made this even more significant was that my birthday is on October 13th, a day that has always carried deep spiritual significance for me. It didn't matter where I was, in India, Portugal, or Peru, something profound would always happen. For a decade, it was like clockwork. But that year, I figured things would be different. I was fully focused on my business endeavors. I had a business meeting in Minneapolis. What could possibly happen there? There was so much to prepare before the meeting, and the pressure was on to get everything right. I wasn't focused on or worried about much else. Meanwhile, back in San Diego, my once peaceful life continued to unravel. I had made the well-intentioned but regrettable decision to rent a room downstairs to a man I befriended on the beach. What I didn't realize at the time was that he was a complete sex addict. Whenever I was home, he wouldn't leave me alone, constantly making inappropriate sexual innuendos and coming on to me. The tension in the house grew unbearable, and I found myself feeling distracted in the very space I had lovingly created to be my haven. Now, I'll admit I was attracted to him. That wasn't the issue. The problem was I knew better than to let those feelings lead me. I made it clear to him that if anything romantic or intimate were to happen between us, we'd need to wait at least 6 months. I valued the peace in my home way too much to risk it. But instead of respecting that boundary, he acted out in defiance. Suddenly, he began bringing a revolving door of women into my home, practically flaunting them in front of me. Became a weekly occurrence. Different women, grand displays of affection right there in my living room on my furniture. The space felt invaded, tarnished by these disruptive and disrespectful acts of entitlement. Due to how important my business endeavors were, I couldn't risk a domestic issue. I was forced to make the difficult decision to just let go of my beloved home and, with it, the life I had built in San Diego. I packed up everything, put my belongings in storage, unsure of my next move, but focusing on peace and success. I ended up renting a short-term furnished guest house in Rancho Santa Fe. In September, I decided to take a road trip to Lake Tahoe for my friend Julie's wedding. And of course, I brought my dog Flash along for the adventure. Driving gave me a freedom to take my time, stopping along the way for hikes and soaking in the beauty of nature. But on every hike, a strange phenomenon began. One that I'd never encountered. Purple rainbows arching over the stream or the foliage in front of me. And it wasn't just once or twice, it was 5 or 6 times. And thankfully I have photos as reminders, but even though I didn't think much of it again at the time, by the 5th one I started to wonder, what is going on? Was this a sign? On my drive back to San Diego, I stopped in Los Angeles to pick up my mail from my P.O. box there in Santa Monica. I received something that I needed to ship out immediately, so I headed over to the nearby FedEx store on Wilshire Boulevard. While I was standing in line, minding my own business, the female customer in front of me erupted in frustration, shouting at the clerk, "I said Rodeo Drive! Rodeo Drive!" she yelled repeatedly, her voice filled with annoyance as she gave him her address. Her outburst immediately jolted me back to a memory from when I had first moved to LA. I had been working as a nanny for a high-profile couple. Warner Brothers producers who we'll call Mr. and Mrs. K. They had 2 daughters, Nina and Jennifer. And one day, while babysitting them, Mr. K asked me to drop him off in Beverly Hills. It seemed simple enough, but on the way there, he asked me to take Rodeo Drive, believing it to be a faster route. The thing is, I was still fairly new to LA, and in my mind, Rodeo Drive was an area for ridiculously expensive shopping, not a street you actually drove down. So as we approached Rodeo, I didn't slow down, I didn't turn, and Mr. K began to yell at me in the same tone I was now hearing at FedEx. Rodeo Drive! I said Rodeo Drive! So the synchronicity of it all hit me, like a ton of bricks. Here I was, standing in the middle of Santa Monica, reliving a moment from 15 years earlier, brought back by the familiar shouts of frustration, and amused by this memory, I pulled out my phone to message Nina, wanting to share the coincidence with her since I was waiting in line. But as soon as I opened my Facebook messages to message her, there it was, a message from Nina from several days earlier. My smile faded as I read her words. Mr. K passed away. His service is Monday at 12 p.m., which is 2 hours away. I froze. The timing was unbelievable. The same family I was just reminiscing about with a memory so clear and vivid that it felt as though it had happened yesterday. And here I was, standing in a FedEx store mere hours away from his memorial service. Without hesitation, I made a quick plan. I had a dress in the car from the wedding that I had just attended. That would suffice for the service. I rushed through my errand, I changed clothes, and I made it to the memorial just in time, still processing how seamlessly all these moments had come together. After the service, Mr. K's daughters, Nina and Jennifer, came up to me, thanking me over and over again for introducing spirituality into their lives when they were younger. It was such a heartwarming moment, and it made me realize just how much of an impact I had left on them. I hadn't seen them in at least 10 years, and yet they remembered those small but meaningful exchanges from their childhood. As we caught up, Jennifer asked what I was up to and where I was living. I laughed and admitted I didn't know exactly. I was thinking about moving back to Los Angeles, but hadn't figured out my living situation yet. And that's when Jennifer casually dropped a bombshell. You know, my dad owned an apartment complex in Westwood. We have a 2-bedroom unit available if you're interested, she said, completely nonchalant, as if she wasn't offering me the perfect solution to my dilemma. Without missing a beat, I said yes. Just like that, the decision to move back to LA was done. A new chapter was set to begin November 1st. But first, Target. Strangely also, around the same time, I found myself being called back to teach at Maha Yoga, the same studio where I'd worked from 1998 to 2002. It was another full-circle moment, and I began subbing classes there on the days I was in town. The warmth and familiarity of the community was undeniable. Many of the same students and members from 15 years ago were still there, and most of them welcomed me back with open arms, as though no time had passed at all. Also during this time, as I prepared for my trip to Minneapolis, I received an unexpected and fabulous gift. One of my private clients, who worked in the music industry, gave me a ticket to a Prince tribute concert in Minneapolis that just happened to be on my birthday, October 13th, the day before my meeting. It felt like a magical alignment, right in Prince's hometown and on my special day. Woo! Now, I know this might sound a bit crazy, but there had been a growing series of Prince synchronicities that had been subtly weaving into my life the past few months. In small, seemingly random ways, Prince kind of kept showing up, but it wasn't until hindsight that I began to really connect all the dots. As I mentioned, I wasn't even a huge Prince fan to begin with, so I started to pay extra attention. The night before my flight, I decided to get my nails done at a local salon. While I was there, I struck up a conversation with a woman who was sitting across from me named Jessica. She mentioned that her boyfriend's birthday was the following day, the same as mine, so we connected immediately. Naturally, this led me to sharing some of my recent Let's Go Crazy Prince moments, and just as we were talking about it, I kid you not, Purple Rain started playing through the salon speakers. We both stopped in awe, wide-eyed, screaming in delight right there in the salon. We instantly bonded over that magical timing. 15 minutes after she left the salon, she texted me with all caps, OMG, including a video to show me what was playing on her car radio when she drove off. Yep, Erotic City. To this day, she's still saved in my phone as Jessica Purple Rain. When I arrived in Minneapolis, things got even stranger. After landing, I went straight to my hotel, quickly showered and changed for the Prince tribute concert that night in St. Paul at the Xcel Energy Center. And here's where it gets wild. I found myself seated not just anywhere, but 40 feet from the stage with a perfect view. But even more surreal, I was sitting right next to Prince's family, his brother, his sister, and close relatives. I believe this was maybe the birth of my very first selfie with none other than Tika, Prince's sister. The night was already set to be extraordinary. But then, Stevie Wonder, Chaka Khan, Sheila E., The Roots, Erykah Badu, Janelle Monáe, Maxwell, and so many other iconic artists took the stage, performing in what turned out to be a 6-hour ecstatic experience. It wasn't just a concert. It felt like church, an immersion into Prince's world, filled with private clips of him speaking, intimate stories from his closest friends and bandmates, and performances that left me on a euphoric high. And then, this is when I had my what the fuck is going on here moment. The mayor of St. Paul walked onto the stage at the end of the concert holding a large scroll-like document. He took the microphone and declared, October 13th, my birthday, as we know, official Prince Day. As I watched the private clips of Prince and absorbed the energy of the night, I was overwhelmed by the strange synchronicities that had been aligning for months, now culminating in this moment on my birthday. What was happening, I thought to myself. The next day, I had my big meeting with Target. And to my absolute delight, I landed my first order with them. It was a huge milestone, one I'd been working toward for years. I felt like I was walking on air. With more than a few hours to kill before my flight, I decided to take a chance and visit Paisley Park, Prince's iconic estate, before heading to the airport. However, with the concert and the influx of fans in town, the online ticket site showed the tours were completely sold out. I hadn't planned well enough in advance, but how could I have known all of this before it happened? Still, something inside me just wouldn't let it go. After the surreal experience of the tribute concert the night before, even if I couldn't get inside for a tour, I thought at least I could see the outside and soak in the energy of the place. The alternative was sitting in a cold, chaotic airport for hours, and that just didn't feel like the right way to end such a magical trip. So I decided to take my chances. When I arrived at Paisley Park, just as expected, I was turned away at the front entrance. The tours were completely sold out, with a long waiting list of eager fans hoping for a last-minute opening. I stood in the parking lot, feeling a bit disappointed. I'd come so close, yet still missed my chance to experience the magic inside this iconic place. But knowing this could happen, I snapped a photo of the exterior, took a moment to soak in the energy of the space, and began to orient myself to head to the airport. That is, until the universe stepped in, again, in fine fashion and impeccable timing. As I turned towards the road, walking straight towards me was Prince's sister, Tika. Having cheered and danced along together at the concert the night before, she recognized me immediately and greeted me with familiar warmth. She asked what I was doing and why I was leaving. I explained how the tours were sold out, so I was heading to the airport. Without skipping a beat, she smiled and said, "Come with me." Just like that. I was whisked away on a VIP tour of Paisley Park, courtesy of Tika Nelson herself. It was an unbelievable moment that led to an absolutely unbelievable experience, one that truly felt like a divine gift, allowing me to step inside the world Prince had built, filled with music, creativity, spirituality, and impeccable artistry. Upon entering Paisley Park, I walked straight down the entrance hallway, which was lined with Billboard awards, gold records, and photographs of Prince accepting his countless accolades. I was in awe of the sheer magnitude of his legacy surrounding me. The hallway opened up into the atrium, a central lounge space underneath large skylights located in the heart of the first floor. Behind the central lounge was a quiet little kitchen. Curious, I walked over and peered inside, marveling at the thought of Prince spending time here in such an intimate personal space. And then it happened, the most surreal moment of all. Out of nowhere, cutting through the noise of passing tourists, came the unmistakable and ultimate silencing sound of two doves crying. I'd only just stepped inside moments earlier, so I had no idea just how unusual this moment was until 6 or 7 staff members, all dressed in purple Paisley Park t-shirts, came rushing into the atrium. One of them, a woman, clearly in awe, announced breathlessly, "The doves, they haven't sang since Prince died." The space fell silent at that moment, leaving only the sound of these sacred birds, which added an almost mystical layer of this already unbelievable experience. It was a scene straight out of a dream. The weight of her words hit me like a tidal wave. I had chills running up and down my body. This wasn't just a routine moment. This was something special and sacred. The doves, named Divinity and Majesty, were perched upstairs just above the atrium. They had been silent since Prince's passing, and here they were, breaking their silence in that exact moment, as if they too were welcoming me into this surreal space. I stood there frozen in awe, realizing that this was more than just a tour. It felt like an ethereal, divine connection. I was hyper-aware, disregarding time in every way, just listening to everything, feeling it all. It was a moment that transcended explanation. If you've read my book, Meaningful Coincidence, you may recall an experience I share about my time in India in 2004, also on my birthday, which parallels what I felt at that moment in Paisley Park. Back then, in 2004, I was overwhelmed by the intensity of synchronistic events and the shock factor of feeling a deep sense of responsibility, fear, confusion, and a desire to run from the perfectly aligned experiences entirely. In India, those emotions had nearly consumed me. But this time, as they resurfaced while standing in the heart of Prince's home, I made a different choice. Instead of retreating or resisting the flood of emotions, I leaned into them. I listened. Rather than letting that fear take over or the inner voice speaking, "Don't think you're special," I embraced it, recognizing that those profound moments were not meant to be escaped, but experienced. Something within me had shifted, and in that moment, I realized how much I had grown since that experience in India. Here, in the place where Prince lived, created, and died, I chose to stand still and open myself to whatever spirit was showing me. As I wandered through the halls of Paisley Park, the weight of everything began to settle in. This wasn't just a museum, it was a journey into the heart of an artist who had poured every ounce of his soul into his craft, leaving behind something far greater than mere songs or performances. It was a space infused with the spirit of this man, who had stood for something beyond fame and fortune. He stood for truth, enlightenment, and the audacity to defy conventions. I was granted access to listen to the very last track he had been recording before he passed. The music was alive, even unfinished. In his private meditation room, which he called the Galaxy Room, I sat in stillness, meditating, feeling the energy he had cultivated in that space. It was peaceful, yet electric and pulsing with funk. I danced under the spinning mandalas in his performance hall, feeling the pulse of the space as if it were still alive with his presence. I even had the chance to sit at his desk, his actual desk. It was such a grounding moment, a reminder that this icon, this untouchable figure, was also just a man with dreams and battles and paperwork. There were, of course, the tourist areas filled with memorabilia and presentations, but the most profound moments when I was allowed to simply be in the spaces he had inhabited, spaces that felt sacred, not because of their physical contents, but because of the energy they held. What struck me the most was the palpable sense of purpose that lingered in the air. Again, Prince wasn't just an artist, he was a warrior of truth. A man who stood up to the injustices of the world, called himself a slave to his recording label, and spoke out in the name of something far greater than fame. He fought for creative freedom, for enlightenment, and he was aligned with I am consciousness, as am I. So much of this book is calling out exactly what Prince fought against. He didn't just make music. He stood as a fierce advocate for integrity and authenticity in an industry that often chews people up and spits them out if they refuse to submit and conform. He called out the hypocrisy, the exploitation, and the hollow promises that lure people in only to rob them of their essence. I see now that everything I'd been feeling, everything I'd been fighting for is part of the same battle, to push back against a suppressive system that values profit over soul and image over substance. In that moment, I finally allowed myself to fully align with what had felt like a woo-woo, hippy-dippy, exaggerated coincidence, however anyone wants to explain it, whether as synchronicity, divine timing, cosmic resonance, harmonic convergence, or something else entirely. I no longer care. What I do know is this: it was an undeniable force, and my mind has a sharp, almost instinctive way of solving riddles, seeing through people's lies and piercing together spiritual patterns and synchronicities. It's like a combination byproduct of being both hypervigilant from my upbringing and trained as a yogi committed to peeling away illusions to embrace reality most truthfully. This combination gives me a clarity to see both deceptions and alignments that others might miss, allowing me to navigate life with a sharper lens, one that looks beyond surface-level realities. As Nietzsche so perfectly put it, those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music. For those of us who live authentically and refuse to conform to society's narrow expectations, we may seem insane to those brainwashed by the world. But we are the ones fearlessly dancing to the true pulse of life. This is what I've been called to do, and this is what I will always lean into. The only other person I've met with the same refined, hyper-vigilant abilities that I possess is my father, Al. Growing up, I believed his exceptional and fearless ability to read people came from the hypervigilance he developed during his time serving in the Army while in the Vietnam War. He was never treated for his PTSD. Those were different times. But as I got older and began experiencing similar traits myself, I started to realize that his perceptiveness wasn't solely a byproduct of the war. It was part of who he was, something deeper, energetic and genetic as well as developmental. Even as a child, I connected with him on a level I couldn't fully comprehend at the time. I empathized with his pain and frustration, and I was mostly patient with his temper and moments of isolation when he felt misunderstood. It wasn't that I understood what he was going through intellectually, but I felt it. I must have related to him on a spiritual and emotional level, long before I could consciously grasp the complexities of the situation. When I returned to California, the synchronicities surprisingly continued to unfold. Just 2 weeks later, I made the big move from San Diego into the Westwood apartment exactly as planned. The process was utterly exhausting, and within a few days of settling in, I was off to lead a 3-day detox retreat for 42 people in Desert Hot Springs. That experience, while rewarding, left me doubly drained. So by the time Monday rolled around, I was beyond ready to take a few days off, desperate to restore my energy, fully unpack, and mentally regroup. I had a massive task ahead of me, fulfilling my first target order. The excitement was there, but I knew I needed to regain my strength to rise to the occasion. I literally said out loud, "You are not going anywhere today." Then, at 9:20 a.m., just as I was finishing my morning coffee, my phone buzzed from a text from Elise, a fellow yoga teacher. She was in a bind and asked me to sub her class at Equinox in Santa Monica at 10:45 a.m. I hesitated for a moment and then replied, "Sorry, no can do today." But she again asked, hitting me with a plea that tugged at my heart. Her dog was having a health emergency and she needed to take him to the vet. That got me. As a dog owner myself, I completely understood the panic and helplessness that comes with those situations. So, despite my desperate need for rest, I sighed and texted back, "Okay, I'll cover it." I figured I could push my day off to tomorrow instead. It was just going to be one class, right? When I arrived at the studio, I decided to play my April Prince playlist. It had been a long time since I played that particular set, since the night Prince passed away, actually. The energy in the yoga room was great, and there was a strong group ready for class. But then, something strange and completely unexpected happened. As Purple Rain began to play over the speakers, a young blonde woman practicing on a purple mat right in front of me caught my attention. She sat down on her heels towards the back of her mat, gesturing for me to come over to her. I walked towards her, and with an almost concerned look on her face, she pointed to the sweat imprint on her mat. And there it was, a perfect, heart-shaped imprint right in the center of her mat. Aw, how cute, I thought. But then she looked up at me with wide eyes and asked, "What does it mean?" as if I had any insight. I crouched down next to her, still teaching the rest of the class. And I paused for a moment, not wanting to project anything on her experience, and I said, only the person viewing a sign can truly decipher its meaning. But I've heard that purple rain symbolizes new beginnings, so maybe there's something exciting on the horizon for you in love. Her eyes lit up at my answer, smiling, clearly satisfied with the interpretation. So she returned to her mat and slipped seamlessly back into the flow of practice as the song continued to wrap its magic around the room. I decided to capture the heart-shaped sweat imprint for her, so I made my way to the stereo cabinet to grab my phone. As I turned around, ready to take the photo, something even stranger happened. I honestly thought I was getting punked. A man in the far back row and right far corner, George, a regular who I knew well, jumped off of his mat like he was playing hot potato. His eyes were wide, his hands covering his mouth, and he let out a high-pitched squeal. George was never like this. At first, I was convinced that he was mocking the woman's moment, but something about his expression was too genuine. He frantically called me over, waving me toward his mat. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Was everyone playing some kind of joke on me? What the hell was happening? George pointed at his mat with one hand, the other hand still over his mouth. "It's Prince!" he yelled. His sweat imprint sat just above the yoga mat's surface. It hadn't fully absorbed into the mat, and it was unmistakable. It was Prince himself holding his hands in a heart shape. The boots, the pompadour hair, the signature bell sleeves, it was all there. I was stunned, frozen in disbelief, staring at what felt like an impossible image. George, equally shocked, reached out and rubbed his hand over the sweat mark, but it didn't move. It didn't change shape. The mark stayed perfectly intact. I had no choice but to stop the class. This was too surreal not to acknowledge. "Okay, everyone," I announced. "Let's come into pigeon pose. I'm going to give a lesson on synchronicity today because I have been experiencing a wild ride with some Prince synchronicity lately, and you are now all witnesses to this today." While they settled into the stretch, I told the class about what had been swirling around in my life in the past few months. The Prince moments, the concert, sitting next to his family, the unexpected declaration of official Prince Day on my birthday, the doves singing in Paisley Park, and now this. Prince literally appearing in George's sweat right here in the middle of a yoga class. I could see the class leaning in, curious but also reflective. We live in a world where we're constantly moving, but if we're always in motion, we miss the small things, the details, the moments that are trying to speak to us. Life has a way of nudging us, whether through synchronicities, signs, or just a quiet moment of clarity. The energy in the room shifted, and I could feel that everyone was beginning to internalize the message. Pay attention to the little things, the coincidences that don't feel like coincidences, I said. These moments are guiding us, if only we can slow down enough to hear what they're saying. For the rest of the class, there was a collective sense of peace and presence. A reminder, again, that magic does indeed exist and that it's more natural than we're led to believe. This was no accident, and it also felt incredibly refreshing to have solid witnesses to what was happening in my life. No one would have believed me otherwise. After class, George was still sitting there, staring at his yoga mat in awe. "I don't want to roll it up," he said, quietly, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked up at me, dead serious. "Prince is trying to talk to you." I laughed nervously, though I knew he wasn't joking. "I know," I said, "but what? What is he trying to say?" George was one of the most intuitive, spiritual people I knew. Highly tuned in, compassionate gay man. If anyone were to deliver a message from Prince, it would probably be him. So he thought for a moment, and then he finally said, "I think you were lovers in a past life." I shook my head, unconvinced. That answer didn't resonate with me. It felt too easy, too predictable. People love to default to the idea of past life romances when faced with the unknown, but this felt deeper. It felt more spiritual, more pure, more present. It wasn't about romance. It was about something bigger, something universal. I just didn't know what it was yet. "It's more than that," I told him. "I feel like it's about purpose, alignment, something beyond just a personal connection." George nodded, still staring at the mat, and I could tell he understood what I meant. I glanced down at my hands, and they were trembling. My heart was racing. I could barely process what had just happened. George's words echoed in my mind. "Prince is trying to talk to you, but what could all this mean?" By the time I was heading out the door from Equinox, it was 12:15 p.m., and I was still buzzing from the surreal events of the morning. I glanced down at my phone as it had started ringing. It was Maha Yoga. I answered the call. "Hi, Alanna, it's Anna. We've had an emergency, and Jenny can't teach her 12:45 class today. Is there any chance, please, that you could cover this class in 30 minutes? I let out a laugh, shaking my head. It was clear that there was no such thing as a day off for me today. I was only 20 minutes away from Maha, so it wasn't a huge inconvenience, but I was still drunk on what had just happened. My mind was racing, trying to process George's words, the Prince figure in the sweat, everything. But there wasn't time to sit and reflect. It seemed that Prince had more plans for me today. "Sure," I said. "I'm on my way." Anna sounded elated and grateful, so with a mix of curiosity and anticipation, I headed over to Maha Yoga. As soon as I entered the yoga room, something immediately caught my eye, a striking purple amethyst crystal ball sitting right in the center of the teacher's platform. It shimmered through the studio window light, fully claiming its presence. I'd never seen this there before, but what puzzled me the most was that nobody seemed to know who it belonged to. And trust me, I asked everyone in the studio, and no one could give me an answer. Teaching that class, I was admittedly distracted. The events of the morning were still swirling in my mind. Naturally, I played the same Prince playlist that I had used earlier. It felt like the fitting thing to do. Once again, as the familiar notes of Purple Rain filled the space, I guided the class into Shavasana, the final resting pose. I took the opportunity to meditate myself. I walked over to the crystal ball, I sat down, and I gently held it in my hands, feeling its cool surface grounding me. I closed my eyes, heart and mind open, and I silently invited whatever message might be trying to come through. This room, Maha Yoga, wasn't just any room. It held deep significance for many people and for me personally. It was where I started teaching yoga back in 1999. Yes, that's 1999. Those early years were so pure. I even called my classes Pure Yoga. A room filled with light, memories, alignments, and beginnings. And then, just as I surrendered to the stillness, I heard it, clear and unmistakable, as it whispered directly into my soul, "You're home. You're home. You're home." The words just echoed softly but powerfully over and over again, leaving me with an overwhelming sense of peace and clarity. It was as if I was being reminded that despite all the twists, turns, and trials, this was exactly where I was meant to be. I was home. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The house in San Diego, the sudden misalignment I'd been feeling, the myriad of synchronicities surrounding Prince's passing, it all seemed to make a little more sense. I'd been swept up in a relentless wave of change, but now, with newfound clarity, I understood that I was exactly where I was meant to be. I was going to make Maha Yoga my home studio and teach here more frequently, I thought to myself. Within 2 weeks, I was again finishing a class at Maha Yoga when I walked into a conversation in the lobby, one that caught me off guard. One of the owner's advisors was sitting outside talking about the studio's future. I overheard something that made my heart sink. They were considering closing the studio. No, no, this can't happen, I thought. Without hesitation, I stepped into the conversation and I asked, how can I help? Bill, an advisor to the owner, explained the financial struggles they were facing. I felt an urgency in my heart. This was the very space where I had begun my yoga journey as a teacher. I couldn't bear the thought of it closing its doors. Listen, I have a garage full of activewear inventory, I told Bill. I'd be happy to donate it to the studio if that would help. Bill said, I'm having a call with the studio owner tomorrow. I'll let you know. And that single sentence somehow inserted me into deeper conversations about the fate of the studio. Suddenly, I found myself involved in discussions about what it would take to keep the studio open and what the future might look like. I ended up sitting in a formal meeting with the building owner, a lawyer, and several advisors. Talk about an unexpected turn. I also learned that a fellow yoga teacher at the studio, Jared, was also working on taking over the lease. Great, I thought. At least it seemed that the studio was not going to die. After the meeting, the owner of the building called me directly. I like you. I like your energy. You have a great brand. I'm not going to give the lease to Jared. He's trying to shove the terms down my throat. Why don't you take it? I was taken aback. This was definitely not what I expected. Jared, after all, was very well known in that community, the most popular teacher there, though not always for the right reasons. He had a bit of a reputation, both as a yoga instructor and as a former adult entertainer, if you know what I mean. Although I wasn't sure about the former part of that, his conflicting reputation in the yoga world wasn't always positive. The building owner explained that Jared's energy and approach didn't align with the changes he wanted to implement at the town center where the studio was located. He wanted something fresh, something positive. In his eyes, I was that change. He saw my energy, my brand, as exactly what the space needed. And just like that, the lease was mine for the taking. However, my brain immediately shouted, "Hell no!" My first instinct was to reject the idea entirely. I wasn't ready to run an entire studio, nor had I ever wanted my own studio. But it was exciting nonetheless. Now, knowing the option with Jared was not going to happen, I reached out to the studio owner to see if there was room for me to partner with him in some capacity. Here's the catch, though. The studio owner was one of the most unresponsive people I've ever dealt with. He'd start a conversation and poof, just vanish, leaving you in limbo without finishing any of the plans or giving any real answers. I found myself in this strange situation thinking I was stepping in to help save the studio, but instead the owner slowly ghosted me, leaving me holding the idea of owning the yoga studio entirely on my own. The long short of it, I was left with a question. Could I, should I, really take on the responsibility of owning a yoga studio? There was no clear direction, no guidance from the owner, just me, a space, and a community I cared about, and a purple crystal ball telling me that I was home. As terrifying as it was equally intriguing. That week, another sign came in that was a stop-in-place moment pushing me towards the decision I was terrified to agree to. I received a notification from Spotify announcing the release of a posthumous track from Prince. Get this, titled As I Am. I signed up for the release. However, before the public could hear it, the release was pulled from Prince's estate several weeks later. Well, I think you've already figured out what happened next. Yes, my ego got the best of me and I chose to party like it's 1999. And let me tell you, the shit show was just about to begin. I decided to make Prince the studio muse. Purple became the official brand color, of course, as a nod to his iconic legacy and the synchronicities that led me there. I incorporated spinning mandalas into the decor, blending them into the music-driven classes that had already been a staple of Maha Yoga. The vibe was set. We had sound, soul, and spirituality. As another nod, I added something special above the entrance of the studio, a decal that read, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to get through this thing called life." It was more than just a lyric. It was an invitation. Prince's words felt like the perfect mantra for everyone who would walk through those doors. Let's go crazy, literally. The last conversations I had with Jared before I officially took over the studio were positive. We had both known each other for over a decade. Jared had attended my yoga classes regularly over the years and even worked as a massage therapist during several of my yoga retreats. There was a sense of camaraderie between us, and I genuinely believed that we were friends. I was led to believe that we shared mutual respect, which is why I assumed stepping into this new chapter together would be smooth and supportive. I mean, we were yogis after all, right? We'd both agreed that regardless of who ended up taking over this space, we would support each other, continue teaching, and create a positive environment for the community. At the time, it seemed like we were on the same page, ready to create a positive solution to the potential closure and keep the community thriving. Well, at least that's what I thought. I had been teaching mostly privately over the past 10 years, traveling a lot and living mostly in San Diego. While I was confident as to being an outstanding teacher with a nationally best-selling yoga DVD, I wasn't looking to be the star of the studio. I wanted to be respectful to everyone. I gave Jared the space to arrange his class schedule however he chose. My intention was to fully support him and the other teachers and make this a positive experience for everyone involved. But shortly after this transition began, it became clear that Jared had no intention of honoring this. He wasn't keen on reciprocating the respect and support as I hoped. Instead, it became evident that Jared was very fickle when it came to supporting me. If he could take credit for the positive aspects of the studio, he was all smiles and optimism. But if some random rich woman didn't like the color of the new floors, Jared was quick to pile on other reasons to belittle me. It was very easy to bend with the wind when it came to the wealthy and influential clients in this upscale community. This began to create a toxic environment that was invisible to others. You see, when students and members were around, Jared played the role of a jolly, kind, and loving teacher. He was always charming in public, projecting an image of unity and support, while behind the scenes, he was undermining my efforts, generating false gossip, including telling people that I stole the studio under him. I had already been through an emotionally abusive relationship with an insecure man, Jack. I wasn't stoked about this one, even if the relationship with Jared wasn't intimate. Yoga teachers often carry an interesting and complex sense of narcissism. I believe every teacher should be required to manage a studio before stepping into the role of an instructor. It's a humbling and eye-opening experience to witness how teachers behave when they're not on the mat and to see the reality behind the metaphorical white robes. We lead groups of people through their bodies and emotions, and in the end, they feel relaxed, euphoric, and better than when they walked into class. Students have a habit of praising the teacher for these highs instead of realizing that it was all their own doing. We simply guide the process. It's very easy for yoga teachers to develop an inflated ego as a result of this, especially men who have a harder time than women when it comes to turning away praise and adoration. Whenever I lead teacher training courses, the first thing I tell future teachers is that as yoga teachers, we must be very mindful not to let ourselves be placed on a pedestal. Being on a pedestal only leads to a few outcomes: isolation, fear of falling, believing a false sense of grandeur, or eventually falling. None of these paths lead to anything positive. We're just yoga teachers, not gods. The discrepancy between how Jared acted in front of others and how he behaved privately towards me was disorienting. It wasn't obvious at first, but soon enough, the cracks in his facade started showing. For him, it wasn't about fostering a thriving studio or maintaining a partnership. It was about his classes, ego, and control, no matter what it cost me. This carefully hidden side of his was far more damaging because it made it nearly impossible for others to see what was happening. The well-known saying, manipulation is when they blame you for your reaction to their toxic behavior, hits the nail on the head here. And I made it easy for him because I became reactive, making it even easier for people to believe his lies. It's no different than how cancer spreads through someone's body. One metastasized, gossipy cell infecting the next until it's out of control. The truth is, Jared was afraid that I would become a popular teacher at the studio, which would threaten his class numbers, his income, and his status as the king. I could understand and empathize with this, but I had made it clear to him that I wasn't like that. He was resentful that my brand was the face of the business. Slowly, I started to see his irritation surface. Whenever I appeared happy, or if I looked attractive, or when students liked me, he couldn't hide his scowl, his squinted eyes, and the shift was palpable. It started with passive-aggressive remarks, but soon escalated into derogatory text filled with insults about anything he could project onto me. He demanded that I consult with him before making any schedule changes. Worst of all, he began spreading hurtful gossip, slowly poisoning the atmosphere in the studio, which really started to affect me emotionally and professionally in and out of the studio. The situation became even more toxic when I learned Jared was sleeping with many of the women who attended his classes. Oh, and there was their monthly group orgy. Whatever. I mean, it didn't bother me. Do you has always been my motto, as long as no one's getting hurt. But that energy came into the studio. The majority of women who came to Jared's classes came for his massages, his adjustments, and his flirtatiously inviting side glances. Some of these women began to treat me like another woman in his life, simply for being the studio owner who happened to be a woman. To them, it was a form of relationship that they wanted so badly to have with him, so they took their pent-up frustrations out on me. Some of these women were outright emotionally unstable sex addicts, hurling insults at me and breaking down in childish tantrums when Jared was out of town, or if he had requested a last-minute sub for his class. I remember one time I had to sub for Jared's class. He had decided to extend his vacation at the last minute, only informing me that same morning. I had started class very flustered due to the aggression I experienced during check-in, dealing with Jared's angry groupies who had not received word in time that he wouldn't be there. Regardless, I made it through the class successfully until, during Shavasana, one of these unstable, quote, students, end quote, got up from her mat and came after me. She was triggered when I gently complimented the group for being open to staying for my class. "You're talking about me," she screamed, jarring everyone out of their rest. If it weren't for Constance Marie, a well-known actress, who stood up and stopped this woman in her tracks, I might have gotten punched in the face right there in class. Constance scolded her. "What's wrong with you? She just gave us a beautiful class and you're berating her?" Constance will always hold a special place in my heart for her fearlessness that day and standing up for me when no one else did. So, if you ever see her in a film or TV show, send her some love. She's one of the rare real ones. Jared's groupies brought attitude and baggage into the studio every single day, and it started to really wear me down. The energy was toxic, and it became increasingly difficult for me to maintain a positive environment. The negativity wasn't just directed at me either. I witnessed other teachers suffer too. Once, I saw a male instructor who subbed for Jared's class walk out of the yoga room in tears. Jared found this whole situation amusing. He actually encouraged their antics because it reinforced his inflated ego. He laughed whenever I was forced to deal with the chaos. It was cruel, and over time I resented him for perpetuating it. But one of the worst moments came when the parents of a 14-year-old girl walked into my studio furious. They told me that Jared had massaged their daughter's ass inappropriately during a class while she was in pigeon pose, specifically touching her in a way that was highly inappropriate for a minor. I was horrified, not only by what had happened, but the gravity of the situation. I begged them not to call the police, promising to deal with it internally, convincing them and trying to convince myself that it was just a yoga adjustment misunderstanding. This was no longer just about a toxic work environment. He was putting my business at risk. I spoke to Jared about this, and I made myself very clear. If this happens again, it's over. In that moment, and in the surprisingly productive changes that followed, I realized that no one had ever set boundaries for him before. He was used to doing whatever the fuck he wanted, whenever he wanted, and to whomever he wanted. But something shifted after that conversation. I saw him change, little by little. He'll probably never thank me for helping him move beyond his turbulent past and bad reputation, but I know I did, and I was happy to see him grow. He found a way to balance just the right amount of bad boy edge to live a good life. But it was still a total shit show. And I'm only grazing the surface as to what went down to give you a general idea of this time in my life. You see, I wasn't expecting my contemporaries and community to become so consumed with envy. One of the most shocking instances came from a former yoga manager at Equinox. When I shared the exciting news that my dolls had been picked up by Target, she didn't offer congratulations. Instead, she replied to my news by telling me, "Go to hell and never contact me again." I was floored by the extreme venom of her response. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a harsh reality that any entrepreneur eventually has to learn, worsened with my particular industry. Yoga teachers can hold a quiet belief inside that they're the best at what they do. For one, there's no one else in the yoga room to compare themselves to, and the process naturally makes students feel great, often independently of the teacher's skill, although they take the credit. So if someone like me all of a sudden has real-world success, well, hold on to your mats because their twisted egos will not be happy. When people sense success, greatness, or authority in someone else, they can often feel threatened or insecure, triggering an instinctive urge to tear that person down. It's a mix of intimidation and a sense of inadequacy within themselves. Now, imagine if that internal sense of lack clashes with their own inflated ego, which is based on other people's responses to their yoga class. Yeah, the result can be a toxic blend of imposter syndrome and a denial-driven defensiveness. Instead of reflecting on their own feelings, it becomes easier to generate untrue, hurtful gossip as a way to smear the very thing or person making them feel bad about themselves. It's a defense mechanism rooted in envy, and unfortunately, celebrities and world leaders experience this abuse exponentially. I have compassion for what they go through and the debilitating mental illness it can induce. I learned quickly that my friends were not my audience, and they were certainly not my customers. The people you expect to cheer for you often find it hardest to see you grow or succeed. It's really important to not take these reactions personally, but I did. Big time. Remember, I was a functional people pleaser, so it hit me harder than most. It can feel isolating and disappointing, but it's part of the journey. Learning that success often comes with a price, and not everyone in your life is going to celebrate with you. I wasn't fully aware of how much the toxic negativity at the studio was affecting me. As, again, a hyper-vigilant person, I sensed people's aggressions and envy more acutely than most. I felt every side glance, every backhanded comment, whisper of untrue gossip, and every unduly rejection. The stress of it all was killing me. Because remember, I couldn't escape. I was experiencing a deep, visceral reaction to the negative energy I was constantly absorbing. In an attempt to deflect this kind of attention, I started changing how I looked. Appearance was the easiest thing to control, so I began to dress down, to hide myself under hats and loose clothing, anything to avoid drawing more attention and triggering further resentment. I was shrinking into myself just to navigate the shit show of retaliation and judgment from people I had thought were my peers, my community, and practicing yogis. But the strategy came at a cost. I was dimming my own light, sacrificing my authenticity just to make others feel more comfortable around me. Looking back, it's heartbreaking to realize that I felt the need to alter my appearance and even my energy, simply to survive in that environment. It was a defense mechanism, a way to shield myself from the storm, but in doing so, I was losing even more of myself, and I started to feel depressed. It's a lesson many of us learn, how easy it is to compromise who we are just to make others feel more at ease. I found myself in a constant uphill battle to defend my efforts, my reputation, and the very vision I had for the studio. It was disheartening and exhausting. People knew Jared longer than me, so they believed his lies. They didn't see him insult me or push me, so they believed him. It soon became apparent that what I thought would be a mutual support system was instead turning into a one-sided, draining endeavor. Jared was out for himself no matter the cost. One member told me, Harness his ego and you'll make a lot of money. Sure, if I were running a sales agency, I understand that strategy. This was a yoga studio, and harnessing an ego for profit just didn't ring true for me. I'm simply not motivated by that kind of approach. After a while, Jared's playbook ran dry with the same predictable tricks. I finally accepted him for who he was. I knew I couldn't change him, so I did the next best thing. I avoided him. I hired staff to cover his classes and adjusted my schedule so I wouldn't be at the studio when he was. It was a simple strategy. If he didn't see me, he couldn't sabotage my happiness or disrupt my peace. I also had to be realistic. I depended on his classes to keep the studio profitable. As much as I wanted to stand up for myself more aggressively, I couldn't afford to rock the boat. I figured I would just get through my lease and then reevaluate my options. It wasn't ideal, but at least it kept things from escalating further. I compartmentalized things. Jared was a situation I had to manage, not a battle I had to fight. So in the meantime, I made the studio my own in every other way I could, building a community and focusing on the people who truly wanted to be there. I actually understood where Jared was coming from, and who knows, I may have acted similarly selfishly if I were in his shoes. It just wasn't easy being in mine at that time. Also, let me paint a wider picture for you. It wasn't just Jared. About 80% of the teachers I, quote, inherited, end quote, from Maha Yoga were alpha dog wannabes, tall, strong, cocky womanizers, some of whom had personal lawyers on retainer due to their rotating misconduct issues. And here I was, a feminist female boss in a world that revolved around their fragile egos. Imagine that. These are the men I had to manage. I mean, it was a nightmare on both sides. And I'm not even going to get started with Rocco. Oh, Rocco, the chemically imbalanced, stimulant-addicted yoga teacher with severe anger issues. The one who stole the keys to my studio, kicked down a door, and for an entire year made it his mission to sabotage me because I had fired him. Like clockwork, he'd show up and break my business signs at least once a month, until I finally captured it on camera and threatened to have him arrested. Haven't seen or spoken to him since. So managing personalities like this is a whole nother chapter in the madness of running a yoga studio in LA. I'll save the rest for another bedtime story. I hadn't realized it yet, but there was a contrasting parallel at play. The more I became aware of my people-pleasing tendencies, the more I realized how they had pigeonholed me into a role I was beginning to resent. It had been much more enjoyable when I only had to manage myself, finding genuine satisfaction in bringing positivity to my private clients. I could please them without issue, and my dysfunction felt rewarded. But now, dealing with toxic teachers and the riffraff of desperate housewives parading through my studio looking for a hot trainer to flirt with, it just didn't satisfy me or check my boxes. So I did what anyone else in my shoes might do in Los Angeles. I pitched a reality show. I mean, why not? This was drama gold. You had the classic battle of the sexes, the clash of personalities, the Brent-titled customers, the sex appeal, the addicted groupies throwing themselves at Jared, and me trying to hold it all together. And let's be real, the story practically wrote itself. I didn't even need to exaggerate the drama. It was all there, raw and real, just waiting for the cameras to roll. But be very, very careful what you ask for. I received interest from a nearby production company that had close ties to a major network, one infamous for its reality shows. The network was intrigued and eager to move forward, but they wanted to run some casting auditions first. I immediately knew I didn't want to include Jared or the biggest offenders in the main cast. The last thing I needed was their toxic energy taking center stage. But as luck would have it, the studio dynamics alone, along with the eccentric personalities, could easily become storylines without Jared or his crew becoming key players. Again, the tension, drama, the day-to-day absurdities at the studio practically wrote themselves. So I went through 3 rounds of casting, picking up some valuable lessons along the way. It became clear that we all needed to have real relationships, dynamic and interesting lives, and importantly to the network, we had to be open to dating as a storyline. Ultimately, the network passed on my pitch because the cast wasn't exciting enough. After all, I was choosing cast members who I genuinely liked. Of course, they wanted more tension. Anyways, I chalked it up as a fun experience with some great lessons learned. But get this. 7 months later, the same exact network put out a casting call for the same exact premise as what I had just pitched. Oh, what a sneaky way to usurp control. And they even informed me of the auditions for it. Honestly, I didn't care which way it came. I jumped back in to try casting again. At one point in the new casting process, I remember a producer looking at me and saying, "So, basically, you threw your career away to babysit LA yoga teachers who think they're God." And I just sat there, speechless. I mean, I didn't say it. He did. But wow, did that hit hard. It was like the culmination of all my frustrations rolled into one brutal truth. I had spent years managing the egos, the drama, the chaos, all while trying to stay true to my own path. Hearing it put that bluntly, well, let's just say it really made me rethink everything. The casting process was moving at a snail's pace, as it does, and all the while, the aggravation from the studio was wearing me down. So when my lease was nearing its end, I knew it wasn't worth renewing. I'd invested so much time, energy, and effort, but my peace of mind was more important. I wanted out. With no clear commitment from the network, I decided to call it quits. It wasn't an easy decision. After all, I'd poured my heart and soul into the studio, hoping for a breakthrough that would make all the struggles worth it. But in the end, the uncertainty combined with the toxic environment made it clear that walking away was the best choice. But then, as fate would have it, and you can probably only predict, 3 months later, after closing the studio, I got the call. The network was ready to issue a contract for the reality show. Oh, the timing! Just as I thought I was ready to close that chapter and move on. Now here I was, faced with the decision, dive back into the madness, or walk away from an opportunity that had taken so much energy and sanity to bring to life. I chose the opportunity, which meant that I would have to reopen a studio. Because deep down, I knew that there was more at stake than just a reality show. I truly believed that exposing the behind-the-scenes antics of the yoga world would not only be hilariously entertaining, but also incredibly enlightening. It's no different than the premise of this book. A chance to pull back the curtain on the superficiality, the hypocrisy, and the absurdities that plague industries we hold up as sacred or designed to serve humanity. I've always been driven to lift the lid on anything fake, and what better way to do it than with a quirky, fun TV show that highlights an authentic brand, sharing real-life experiences. I signed the contract. Posers TV. Things were moving along beautifully. Finally, it felt like all the pieces had come together. "It won't be soon before long" was my motto, inspired by the Maroon 5 song that felt fitting in my life's ever twists, turns, and near touchdowns. What could possibly derail this train this time? Guess again. Oh, a global pandemic. Yes, a global pandemic. Just as everything was falling into place, the world flipped upside down. COVID hit, and suddenly the entire landscape of business, entertainment, and fitness studios, particularly in California, were upended as we knew them. As someone who believes deeply in the power of recurring patterns, I've always made a point to pay attention when similar situations show up in my life again and again. Whenever I seemed inches away from the goal line, something would inevitably come along to detour my bigger success. Naturally, I started questioning myself. Was I self-destructive? Was I afraid of success? Was there something unhealed or unaddressed lurking in my subconscious mind, like an anchor preventing me from progressing? Probably yes to all of those in some form or another. In order to make the reality show around my business a reality, I needed to reopen my yoga studio. Timing, as always, was everything. A good friend of mine, Barry, owned a prime building in Santa Monica, a place he'd been trying to get me into for years, even while it was occupied. The space was beautiful, a former church and a former movie theater right in the heart of downtown Santa Monica. It had incredible energy, a mixture of history and light that made it the perfect space for what I envisioned. Barry had plans to tear down the building, but not in the near future. And I didn't want a long lease as I wanted to see what would happen with this reality show contract before committing to a longer term. It seemed a perfect fit, and I mostly trusted Barry. The opportunity felt too aligned to ignore, so I jumped, heart first, as usual, once again pouring my soul into creating this space. Anyone who has been there knows how special it was. I have a knack for decorating spaces while making them feel welcoming and sacred. It was an absolute dream studio, my Shangri-La, and I was so proud. A new chapter for my business. A show that would expose the realities behind the yoga world while uplifting authenticity. This was it. What could possibly go wrong this time? Well, you'll have to jump to the next chapter to find out the full answer to that. All in all, it was a dream start. The space was perfect. I trained and hired teachers who I admired and who I chose. Hallelujah. And the clientele were amazing. Finally, real yogis who were kind, who came for the practice, not for the gossip, and who appreciated what we did and what we offered. They showed up for themselves. They respected the community we were building. This was a dream come true. I was meticulous in curating my staff, making sure not to hire anyone with an ego grande or attitude problems. Hell no. After all my prior experiences, I had zero tolerance for that energy. My boundaries were strong, stronger than ever, and it was making a huge difference. I even had minimal patience for entitled or difficult clients when those inevitably rolled in. And the result? A peaceful, thriving studio with a sense of authenticity and respect that was palpable. I mean, this is how you make positive change, I thought. This was my Auroville. I was watching it in action. For the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my environment, in control of my business, and aligned with the people around me. Everything was finally flowing again, like I had finally found the sweet spot of balance between business and boundaries. We had cast the reality show with an eclectic crew of fun yoga posers, each more eccentric than the last. There was another porn star who had to be excused once we discovered her side gig, an absolute egomaniac who thought he was a real-life superhero, a delusional and bipolar shaman wannabe, a glam yogi former escort, a model queen, a snarky sound healer, and a codependent, two-faced future therapist who offered unsolicited advice between her personal breakdowns. I have to admit, I was kind of obsessed with them, and we would have, hands down, won an Emmy for this show had it aired. However, things changed with them once they signed their network contracts. Suddenly, they didn't care about actually working. Teaching classes? Too much effort. Showing up on time? Why bother? The allure of potential fame had taken over, and the reality of running a studio seemed burdensome if cameras weren't rolling. The egomaniac, Greg, was really starting to get under my skin, as I'm sure you can imagine, with the little I've shared with you about my personality. He had crossed the line in the most unforgivable way, soliciting one of my receptionists to extract my student email list for him, which included 11,000 names and email addresses. That was years of trust and hard work boiled down to a sneaky, underhanded data grab. I was livid. This wasn't the first time he had crossed boundaries either. I'd already fired him 4 times before, each time hoping things would improve for the sake of the show. I had tried to be patient, tried to keep my cool, but this was an unforgivable level of betrayal. I couldn't look past it anymore. It wasn't just about the show anymore. It was about integrity and protecting what I had built. How could we carry a show with someone I planned to fire on the first episode? I made it clear to the producers, if he was in, I was out. There was no way I was going to continue working with someone who had so blatantly violated my trust, and certainly not while cameras were rolling. This was beyond drama for TV. It was my real life, and I wasn't willing to compromise my values for the sake of keeping a character on the show. Suddenly, I missed Jared. Well, not really, but I found myself appreciating that despite all of his antics and insecurities, at least Jared was communicative with his schedule, took responsibility for his classes, gave his all when teaching, and had a certain level of maturity that I did appreciate. I never thought I'd say this, but in comparison, Jared almost felt likable and manageable. And that's when it hit me. What was I committing to? The reality show, the studio, the drama, the egos, the lack of respect, it was all starting to feel overwhelming and not worth it. It scared me. I'd spent so much time building my brand, pouring my heart into it, and here I was, about to dive headfirst into a whole new world that felt completely out of my control. I was nervous as to where this endeavor was heading and how it would affect my business. Was this really what I wanted? Could I handle this level of intensity? Would I want to work with these kids day in, day out, season after season? Suddenly, the glamorous idea of exposing the yoga world's dark underbelly wasn't feeling as exciting. I had expanded from a 2,500 square foot studio with one room and a store to a 6,500 square foot space that included 2 studios, a store, a lounge, a kitchen, multiple offices, and 4 wellness treatment rooms. Managing it all demanded nonstop effort, simply too much for one person to handle alone. As the initial endorphin rush began to fade, I found myself weighing responsibilities against my original objectives. It forced me to confront a tough question. If the show were no longer a factor, would I still want to keep the studio? Was this truly the life I wanted, or had I been chasing a means to justify the reality that I had landed in a big pile of shit show yoga 4 years ago? Chocolate-covered karma. The past few years, I've started to recognize that sometimes synchronicities can masquerade as chocolate-covered karma, as I like to call it, at least for me. They're sweet, exciting, seductive, irresistible moments tempting me to take a bite when I otherwise wouldn't have, like the time I opened a yoga studio based on one, only for me to realize that I had to confront unresolved aspects of myself. They act as invitations, wrapped in something promising, only for us to realize that underneath the sweetness hides the karmic internal work that we need to do. They're not just random coincidences. They're reminders that healing is an ongoing journey, not a final destination. Each synchronicity carried with it an understanding, a lesson, a challenge, a blessing, or an opportunity to face parts of me needing my attention. And while these synchronicities may have initially felt like signs pointing me towards something magical or transformative, the magical portions couldn't be fully actualized until I did the necessary healing. The opportunities were there, but they stayed just out of reach until I became more whole. The potentiality is always within each of us, waiting for the right conditions in our mind and body to broadcast the right frequency. The more that we resist and fight our natural process, or the more distracted and disconnected we become, the less light we're able to project into our experiences. The mundane versus magical aspect of living is up to us. My impeccable practices had unknowingly created extraordinary alignments, which opened portals into the workings of synchronicity and quantum physics. However, when I had to then step into an imperfect, cruel, and greedy world, the lights quickly blew out, like candles in the wind. I bet you know the feeling. But here's the thing I've learned. Wherever you go, there you are. No matter how tantalizing the synchronicity or how aligned things might seem on the surface, we can't outrun the lessons we're meant to learn or expect to be perfect without practice. As long as we're engaged in our lives, the same themes and lessons will keep showing up, waiting for us to realize them, whether we're managing a yoga studio, selling new cars, or starting law school. How we view the world is shaped by an internal lens, and that lens can only be corrected from the inside. I also view synchronicities as viable pregnancies, full of potential and opportunity, ripe with promise. But not all pregnancies take hold. In some of my experiences, my unhealed traumas have often acted like hidden landmines or scars, preventing these spiritual pregnancies from going full term. It's like there's a dance we're engaged in, a dance of free will, a dance of karma, a dance of desire and opportunity. And if we're dancing while carrying the heavy baggage of past wounds and unaddressed pain, it inevitably changes every step we take, and it alters the outcome to every opportunity that comes our way. Had I not carried wounds from narcissistic men, I probably wouldn't have had issues with Jared or the likes of him. But if I hadn't been affected by those experiences, I might have settled into a deeply dysfunctional situation without realizing it. So, one isn't necessarily better than the other. Both are part of the learning process, and I believe that we have to trust our intentions and our timing. The changes we seek, the healing we crave, they all source from inside. Everything else, every person, every challenge is just an opportunity, an exercise to grow and to learn from our experiences. I learned the hard way. I had to stop everything. I had to turn inward, stop chasing the next distraction, believing that when that happens, then I can heal. Instead, I had to trace where the cracks from past abuse and disappointments had formed and not keep sealing them back up, but to let the light in and let the darkness out. That's when real healing began for me, not by avoiding the pain or trying to override with distractions, but by sitting with it, listening to it, letting it unravel, and ultimately allowing it to naturally step out of its constraints and into a new liberated life. We are energetic beings, constantly emitting energy coded with our heart's purpose and our mind's intentions. We have the power to create a harmonious concert of energy, one that is healing, resonant, and aligned with our truth. Or, conversely, we can emit discord, confusion, distraction, and chaos. The beauty of it all, it's entirely up to us. We're the conductors of our own energy, and how we choose to resonate shapes the experiences that we create.